This video is going to tell the story of the Lega five-star government, how it was formed, what happened during the 15-month term that it lasted, and finally I'm going to explain the crisis that brought the government to an end. Let's start off with the election results from 2018. Here are the three coalitions that fought the election. The three photos here are Matteo Renzi, he's the leader of the Partito Democratico, known as the PD. In the middle is Luigi Di Maio, he's the leader of the five-star movement, and on the right we have Matteo Salvini, leader of the Lega. The numbers here represent the percentage of seats that the various parties won. It's not the percentage of vote, it's the percentage of seats. And there's two numbers beside each party. The first number is for the lower house, the Chamber of Deputies, and the second number is for the Senate, the upper house. And a government needs a majority in both houses to govern. So you can see that none of the coalitions had enough seats for a majority, so there had to be some type of an arrangement between two of the three, and all of the possible permutations here were problematic. The previous government had been a centre-left, centre-right coalition, but Matteo Renzi, he didn't want to continue that, he wanted to go into opposition. His party, the PD, had taken a big hit at the polls. So that meant the only option was some type of an agreement between Five Star and the centre-right. But Five Star didn't want to deal with Berlusconi and his party, Forza Italia. Five Star are very much an anti-establishment party, and it's hard to think of anyone who represents the establishment in Italy more than Berlusconi. So in the end, what happened was Lega broke away from the rest of the centre-right, and they reached an agreement with Five Star to form a coalition government. Lega did that on good terms. The centre-right coalition was maintained at the regional level. It was called the Government of Change. They brought in an independent law professor called Giuseppe Conte. He was the Prime Minister. Di Maio and Salvini would both be Deputy Prime Ministers. Di Maio became Minister for Economic Development and Salvini became Interior Minister. That's the job that Salvini really wanted because it gave him control over the issue of migration. The government lasted 15 months. It wasn't a total disaster. They got some good legislation passed, some important legislation from the point of view of the parties, starting off with the Reddito di Cittadinanza, which was a payment of around €200 a month to people who are earning below a certain amount. This was a key election pledge of Five Star. It was an important part of their manifesto, so getting that law passed was certainly a feather in their cap. Salvini got his immigration and security law passed. But there were always arguments between the two parties, especially when it came to the TAV, which is this high-speed train between Turin in northern Italy and Lyon in France. Lega are in favour of it, Five Star are opposed to it. The problem with the TAV will come up again later. The biggest scandal during the government's term was probably the BuzzFeed Russia story. BuzzFeed obtained a recording of a man called Gianluca Savini. Savini was negotiating in Moscow an oil deal with the intention of siphoning off €65 million from the oil deal illegally and funneling these funds to Lega to fund their election campaign. This man, Savini, it's not clear exactly what relationship he has with Salvini. It's not clear what Salvini knew. It's not clear whether the deal went through in the end. Salvini rode this storm by basically denying everything. He denied he knew that there had been negotiations, he denied that there had been a deal agreed, and he denied that Lega had received any money from Russia. The migrant ships in the Mediterranean were a big story during this government. The two most important, probably the Aquarius in the summer of 2018. Salvini got into trouble when he refused to allow the migrants on board to disembark. And in the summer of 2019, we had the Sea-Watch 3 and its captain, Carola Racketa. This ship entered the port of Lampedusa despite being explicitly instructed not to, and it rammed a boat of the Italian financial police on the way into the port. I think it's fair to say that Salvini exploited the issue of the migrant ships. It was popular with voters and he knew this. Certainly listening to Di Maio talk, you can get a feeling of frustration that Di Maio, although he's no fan of these migrant ships, he feels that it's something of a distraction, that the actual numbers coming in on these high-profile ships is relatively small and it distracts from the wider issue of the migration problem. We need to talk as well about Salvini's use of social media. He's way ahead of the other parties in the way that he uses Facebook, for example. He does all these live streams. He holds rallies in town centres across Italy. He puts the videos of those up on his Facebook page as well. He's on TV regularly. Those videos go up as well. And all of these videos get huge views, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of views. Salvini's a great communicator, and this combined with his use of social media and his adoption of popular policies led to a huge increase in support for Lega during the term of this government. Here we can see how much the support for the party grew. These are the averages of the opinion polls from the various quarters since the Italian election in 2018. These numbers are the percentage of the vote that the parties are expected to get according to the opinion polls. Now, the magic number here is 40. Italian political scientists are of the opinion that once a party or a coalition of parties can get to 40% of the popular vote, they're probably going to end up winning more than 50% of the seats. This is because the larger parties tend to hoover up the single seat constituencies, which are won based on a first-past-the-post system. So the Italian system is quite complicated. Some seats are awarded based on this first-past-the-post single-seat constituencies, and others are awarded based on a party list. And there can be quite a big disparity between the percentage of the vote that you get and the percentage of the seats that you get. And anyway, these political scientists think 40 is the magic number. Once you can get to 40, you're probably looking at winning a majority of the seats. And you can see that Salvini and his allies, Forza Italia, that's Berlusconi's party, and Fratelli d'Italia, that's Giorgia Meloni's party, they've been at that 40% mark or above since 2018 Q2. Now, this is really important to bear in mind when we move on to the crisis which happened, because at the back of Salvini's mind all the time while this government, this five-star Lega government is continuing, Salvini's thinking, if there was an election held now, I'd get in on my own with my allies, Forza Italia and Fratelli d'Italia. I'd probably be Prime Minister. I wouldn't be in a 50-50 type arrangement with Five Star. I'd be dominating this new coalition. He'd much prefer to be in with Forza Italia and Fratelli d'Italia. First of all, because he would dominate that coalition in terms of numbers, and secondly, because those parties are much closer ideologically to Lega than Five Star are, and Salvini would probably be Prime Minister. So this is something we need to bear in mind when we start to talk about the crisis which comes up. The Italian government crisis started on the 7th of August. It was a vote on the TAV in the Senate. Five Star voted against it, Lega voted for it. But what really annoyed Salvini was that Giuseppe Conte, the Prime Minister, he was in favour of the TAV. He didn't attend the debate. Salvini then launched a vote of no confidence in Conte, saying that this was a government of no, it was a government which turned down every proposal and it was time to go back to the people and hold new elections. So this is what Salvini thought was going to happen. There was going to be a vote of confidence, a vote of no confidence in Conte in the Senate. Lega, Fratelli d'Italia and Forza Italia would vote against Conte, as would the PD, the Partito Democratico. They would vote against Conte as well. The only people who would vote for Conte would be Five Star. So the government would collapse, and it would then pass over to President Mattarella to decide what to do. Mattarella would look at the situation in Parliament, and he would have to decide whether there was a possibility of an alternative government being formed which could command a majority. And seeing as though both the centre-right parties and the PD were not willing to work with Five Star, this is what Salvini thought was going to happen. Seeing as though the PD and the centre-right wouldn't work with Five Star, and they weren't willing to work with each other either, that would mean that Mattarella would then be forced to hold new elections. Salvini and his allies would win the elections, they'd win quite a large majority, and Salvini would be the Prime Minister. So that's what Salvini thought was going to happen. That's what he hoped was going to happen. So key to all of this, key to Salvini's plan working, was going to be what the PD were going to do. Now here are the two key players in the PD. On the left, that's Niccolò Zingaretti. He's the leader of the PD. He took over after the last election when Renzi stood down. On the right, that's Matteo Renzi. He's the former leader of the PD, but he's still a very influential voice within the party. There's actually a bit of a split in the PD. There's a Zingaretti faction and a Renzi faction, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So Salvini's plan was predicated on the PD deciding that they didn't want to work with Five Star and that they would prefer to hold new elections. It wasn't an unreasonable assumption for Salvini to make. The PD and Five Star don't like each other, and there's been some harsh words exchanged between the two parties in the past. The PD don't like Five Star's citizens' income, the reddito de cittadinanza policy. They don't like Five Star's Euroscepticism. They don't like the immigration policies that they've been willing to support during the Lega Five Star government. And they don't like this Rousseau system, this online platform that Five Star use to consult their party members about policy decisions and votes in the parliament. Sometimes Five Star consult their members as to how they should vote on certain issues in the parliament. As for Five Star, they see the PD as part of the establishment. And remember, Five Star are very much an anti-establishment party. And both Beppe Grillo, the founder of Five Star, and Luigi Di Maio, who's the leader of the political party, they've both said some pretty strong things about the PD in the past. On August 11th, this was 4 days after the start of the crisis, Zingaretti wrote an op-ed piece in the HuffPost. Zingaretti said it would be a mistake for the PD to work with Five Star and that they should hold elections. If they didn't hold elections, it would mean that Salvini and Lega would go into opposition, and that would give him a lot of fuel. It would give Salvini a position that he could exploit, and that would be a mistake. As for Renzi, he'd been criticising Five Star ever since the last election. He'd been using a hashtag on Twitter, Senza di me, without me, saying that if the PD was going to work with Five Star, it would be without him, it would be without Renzi. Now, he'd still been saying this as recently as July. So it looked initially like Salvini had judged the situation correctly and that there wasn't support in the PD, either from the Zingaretti faction or the Renzi faction, to work with Five Star, and that there was going to have to be new elections. On the same day that Zingaretti released that op-ed in the HuffPost, Renzi gave an interview to the Corriere della Sera. Now, this was the big twist, this was the big change, and this was the moment when Salvini realised that he'd misjudged the situation. Because in this interview, Renzi said it would be crazy to go to the polls now to agree to an election, and that PD should work with Five Star, that they should support some type of short-term government to get the budget passed and maybe also get this electoral reform that Five Star were trying to pass in the parliament, which would reduce the number of deputies and senators by half. So Renzi said what we should do is we should support some type of short-term government, pass the budget, pass this electoral reform, and then go back to the people. Renzi was only talking about a short-term government at this point, but ultimately the PD and Five Star would agree to a proper government. It wouldn't be a caretaker or an interim government, it would just be a standard coalition. So why did Renzi perform this about-face? Well, I think there's three reasons mostly. The first is the budget. The Italian budget is introduced into the parliament usually in mid-October. So holding an election in late September, sometime in September, was going to complicate this issue. It was going to make it more difficult to get a budget passed. Now, this year's budget in Italy is particularly important because the Italian public finances are not in a great shape. And the default position at the moment is for there to be a VAT increase, a value-added tax rate, which is a tax on goods and services throughout Europe. This is going to increase by default if there isn't a new budget passed. Now, this is a particular problem. There's a consensus amongst economists that VAT increase is really going to damage the economy, and politicians realise that VAT increase is going to be very unpopular with voters as well. So there's a keenness and a realisation that this budget is really important. The government needs to find 23 billion euros somewhere in order to avoid this VAT increase. So Renzi's saying, look, let's get this budget passed first. There's also a concern about what would happen if Salvini got in with a majority. He's always tried to push the EU on the budget deficit rules, and there's a concern amongst Renzi, for example, is concerned about what that would mean, if what the implications would be of a Salvini-led budget. So that's the first issue, the whole issue of the budget. The second issue is no one wants a Lega government. I mean, the PD, they don't like Five Star, but they really don't like Lega. So I think it's a lesser of the two evils situation here for the PD. I also think there's a degree of political expediency here. The PD are hoping if they can get into government, pass this budget and pass the electoral reform, maybe in a few months' time they'll be more popular, maybe Lega's support will go down a bit, and maybe the political situation will be a bit better for them in terms of holding an election. The final issue was, and Renzi denied this, but it was widely discussed in the Italian media, it's this split in the PD between the Zingaretti faction and the Renzi faction. And the Renzi faction were worried that if there was an election held now, that Zingaretti would deselect a lot of them, because he would prefer deputies and senators who were loyal to him. So there was a concern amongst some PD politicians, members of parliament, they would be deselected if there was an election held straight away. So there are the three reasons why there was this about face, this change of idea, and this support for a PD five-star government. First of all, this concern to get this important budget passed, a concern to try and keep Salvini out of government, and then this internal split within the PD as well, and a desire to avoid being deselected by the party when the election comes up. On August the 20th, we had the big set-piece moment of the whole government crisis. This was the vote of no confidence in Prime Minister Conte. So here's Conte, he gave a speech lasting about 50 minutes in the Senate, defending the record of his government. It took about 2 weeks to hold this vote of no confidence. Salvini wanted to hold it much sooner. The problem was August is a difficult time to get anything done in Italy because an awful lot of staff are on their holidays. So this was 2 weeks after the crisis started. They say that a week is a long time in politics. Well, this was 2 weeks and an awful lot had changed. In fact, by this stage, Salvini had realised that he'd made a mistake, and he realised that there was a real chance of there being a PD five-star government and that he wasn't going to get the election that he wanted. Salvini had even tried to build bridges back to five-star by this point, but Di Maio had rejected his attempt. Di Maio had said, Salvini is repentant now, but it's too late. So Conte gave this speech. It was quite awkward because Salvini had to sit behind him during this whole speech, and Conte was, really sticking the boot in. He was really criticising Salvini harshly, and there were some tense moments. Salvini had to sit there because the government hadn't been officially dissolved at this stage. So you're looking at the current government, you're looking at the Prime Minister, and you're looking at the two Deputy Prime Ministers. The government hasn't been dissolved yet. Conte criticised Salvini for his use of the crucifix. Salvini sometimes uses the crucifix when he's giving speeches. He holds it in his hands and he talks about his faith and so on. And Conte has said that this is a breach of the principle of secularism. He criticised him. He said he had caused this government crisis and he was acting in the interests of his party and in his own interests, and he was not acting in the interests of Italy. He also said that Salvini should have come to the parliament and explained himself about the BuzzFeed Russia scandal. I've subtitled a short passage of the speech here. This was probably the most tense moment of the speech.
Questo è un governo che ha lavorato intensamente sino all'ultimo giorno e ha prodotto numerose, significative riforme. Altro che governo dei no. La verità è un'altra. All'indomani della competizione europea, il ministro dell'Interno e leader della Lega, forte del successo elettorale conseguito, ha posto in essere un'operazione di progressivo distacco dall'azione di governo, un'operazione che ha finito per distrarlo dai suoi stessi compiti istituzionali e lo ha indotto alla costante ricerca di un pretesto che potesse giustificare la crisi di governo e il ritorno alle urne.
So after Conte had finished his speech, he decided to resign, so the vote of no confidence didn't take place in the end. We then had a period of around 2 weeks in which President Mattarella tried to see if there was majority support for a different government, an alternative government. So the PD and Five Star held talks during this time. Those talks weren't always easy, but in the end they did agree to a government, and it wasn't a caretaker or interim government, just a standard coalition government. And on the 5th of September, Conte was sworn in for a second term as Prime Minister. This was the moment that Salvini dreaded. He'd rolled the dice and he'd lost.
Giuro di essere fedele alla Repubblica di osservarne lealmente la Costituzione e le leggi e di esercitare le mie funzioni nell'interesse esclusivo della Nazione.
So that was the story of the 15-month Lega five-star government, how it was formed, how it got on, and ultimately the crisis that led to its end. Was Salvini naive in thinking that the PD would do what he thought they would do? Should he have been able to predict that maybe the PD would do everything they could to keep Salvini out of government and that maybe they would choose the lesser of two evils? Well, look, everyone can make up their own mind about that, but ultimately Salvini took a risk and he lost, and now he's in opposition. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks for watching, and until next time.